Good evening, everyone. This is the fourth and final talk of the Monhegan Associates Ecology Lecture Series for this summer. I'm Candace Cousins, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of my co-chair, Tish Miller of the Ecology Committee, and Nan Nelson, the Vice President of Monhegan Associates. I would also like to thank Wildlands Coordinator, Rebecca Fitzpatrick, for promoting these lectures on the MAI website, as well as on social media. And I'd also like to thank Claire Durst, who many of you know, who has been at the heart of Monhegan Associates' mission for decades and has served this summer as the head of technological support for this lecture series. Tonight, we're excited and honored to present Eric Lilisov. Eric, did I get that?
Lilisov.
Lilisov. And Eric just told me that in Norwegian, Lilisov means little forest, which I think is fantastic because Eric for years has been studying mushrooms in the little forest of Monhegan. The title of Eric's talk is Hidden Fungal Networks in the Forests of Monhegan. Eric is an adjunct professor in the College of Forest Resources and Environmental Science at Michigan Tech. He received his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at Cornell University. He is also a research ecologist and acting project leader for the United States Department of Agriculture Forest Service. He is an adventurer, a researcher, a teacher, a scientist, and a relative of Nan Nelson. He began seeking out mushrooms in the forests north of Manhattan with his father, who introduced Eric to mushrooms. He spent many years studying mushrooms and the fungal networks of the Monhegan wildlands. Over the past 2 decades, he has co-authored over 80 articles in the field of ecological science. A particular subject he's focused much time and thought upon is soil biology. And we will be learning tonight about a particularly wondrous aspect of soil biology, and that's the hidden fungal networks. The lecture will be about 45 minutes long, followed by a 15-minute question and answer period with Eric, led by Nan Nelson. After that, I will be making some closing remarks with hopes of seeing you all at next summer's lecture series. And now I will hand it over to you, Eric.
Thanks a lot for that kind introduction, Candace. Yes, I'm Eric Lilisov, as you've heard, and I have a long connection to the island. Was first out on the island in 1973, visiting our really close family friends, the Ensigns, and haven't been there every year, but since I've been married to my wife, pretty much every year, which back in 1992, we got married, 93, we got married on Monhegan. So long time on the island, and I've been looking at the changes in the fungal communities there and thinking about how the things I do elsewhere in the world relate to what's happening on Monhegan. And today, the goal of my talk is to try to not be super technical, but just sort of try to tell a couple of stories about how fungi live on the island and how they are affected by things that happen on the island and in the rest of the world. So let's see if I can get this to advance. There we go. So the questions that I'm going to try to address today in the talk are, what is the relationship between mushrooms and fungi? I don't know if everyone knows that, so we're going to start really basic. What do psylla fungi do for a living and why does it matter? And then we're going to focus in on one group of fungi called the mycorrhizal fungi. So we're going to let you know what mycorrhizal fungi are. Then just look at a little mystery, which is why do mycorrhizal fungi mostly fruit late in the summer? And then talk a little bit about the evidence for interplant mycorrhizal mycelial networks and whether they can be, any evidence of that can be seen on the forests of Monhegan. And then back up a little bit bigger picture and talk about how Monhegan's fungi might be affected by changing environments, including invasive species and nitrogen pollution. So please let me know if you're hearing me okay and if there's any issues. So what are mushrooms? Mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of fungi. And I was told I was going to ask this question, so I'll say it right off the bat. Picking mushrooms does not harm the fungus that the mushroom is part of. So you can pick a mushroom. You don't have to worry about leaving the mycelium at the base because it's part of a much larger mycelial network. And we'll look at that in a few minutes. So a fruiting body is something that helps something reproduce. And if you look at these pictures of the gills and teeth and pores of mushrooms, what you see is the place where the spores are being produced. And these spores are dropped out from the gills onto into the air, and many go onto the ground, and some are transported longer distances. And if anyone's ever done a spore print, they would know this. And it's very easy to do. If you just take a mushroom, put on a piece of paper, you can see the spores dropping onto the paper. If you leave it there for, let's say 12 hours. And here is an example of some spores deposited underneath on the ground underneath this fungus here. This is a dense mat of spores. You see most of them fell directly underneath, but some of them will be transported a few feet. Some will be transported miles or even hundreds of miles away and land in the forest somewhere else. And if it's lucky, it'll germinate there and grow. They need to have a compatible mating pair in the location they land, and then they'll form a dikaryon, typically, which is two mushrooms fusing together and joining their nuclei into one space of the cell. And eventually they'll join those nuclei together to make new spores. So what do fungi do for a living? Really broadly, thinking about the soil and wood fungi that we see on the islands, the main ones are decomposers, pathogens, and mutualists. And I'll get into a little bit more what we mean by mutualists because the main focus of today's talk is going to be on this subgroup of the fungi on the island. We'll see some pictures of some other fungi, but we're going to focus on these guys. So mutualists are organisms that enter into a relationship that benefits both partners in that relationship. In this case, it's something called a mycorrhizal fungus, and I'll give you a little more. First, I'm going to show you some of those mutualists on the fungal side, and then I'll tell you a little bit what a mycorrhiza is. So these are some mushrooms that you see on the island that are part of the mycorrhizal mutualism with trees. These are boletes. These are chanterelles and craterellus and hedgehog or hydnum fungi. They're all related to each other. Also mycorrhizal. These are the amanitas, some of which are deadly, some of which are edible, but they are all mycorrhizal as well. These are russulas you'll also see on the island, commonly are also mycorrhizal fungi. And we'll see they also interact in some interesting other tripartite relationships. So when I'm using this word mycorrhizal without defining it, which is a no-no, right? But I was hoping to get your attention. He keeps saying this word. What does it mean? So myco is fungus and rhiza is root. So it's a fungus root, which is, here's the root itself, right? This is the root of this plant. This is the pine seedling. These are two little pine seedlings growing next to it. And this is a fungus. All the white stuff is all fungal mycelium that's connected through to this root system. So it's a symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic just means two things living together, and it's generally considered mutualistic. And like I said, mutualistic means that both organisms benefit. And the plant provides sugars to the fungus from photosynthesis. So it fixes carbon from the air, shunts it down through the roots, and shares it with the fungus. The roots are really the middlemen in this relationship. They're not the absorptive structures. So if you see these little roots here, they're not doing most of the uptake from the soil. It's actually these guys out in the soil beyond that are doing the uptake. The fungus provides the soil resources, nutrients, and water, and also can provide protection to root systems from from pathogens. So they're critical partners in the relationship. There are two major types of mycorrhizas. There's something called ectomycorrhizas, and I'll show you a little close-up of what that means in a minute, and arbuscular mycorrhizas. And the ectomycorrhizas are the ones that make the mushrooms. So they can form relationships typically with ascomycetes or basidiomycetes, which are just two major classes of higher fungi that make mushrooms. You don't have to worry about the details. There won't be a quiz. And then the arbuscular mycorrhizas, which do not form mushrooms, they're the ancient lineage of fungi that was associated with the first land plants. They do not have a known sexual stage. They make these tiny little spores in the soil. The ectomycorrhizas are associated with a list of trees that you'll notice incorporate many of the trees that you see on Monhegan. So the pines, the oak family, the birch family, the willow family, and then a bunch of other families from around the world. So the Myrtaceae and the dipterocarps from Australia and Southeast Asia. It's in the southern hemisphere. And then the arbuscular mycorrhizas form relationship with most other plants, including these tree species that you will also find, many of which you'll find on the island as well. So if you look under these trees, yes.
Is everyone seeing Eric's presentation? If you're not, go to where you're looking at gallery view, go and change it to speaker view. Okay? Go ahead, Eric.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Sorry.
Yeah. And so, where were we? So these don't make mushrooms and these do. So if you're looking for mushrooms, you're better off looking under these species on the left here than the ones on the right. Okay, advancing the screen. Here we go. So what is an ectomycorrhiza? Ecto just means surface. It does not enter the root cells. So here's a cross section of a root. The ectomycorrhizas form around the outside of the root. They make a sheath around the outside of the root, and they go between the outer cells of the root. And they exchange resources with those cells without entering the cells. It's distinct from the endomycorrhizas, such as the orchid and the arbuscular mycorrhizas, which actually enter through the cell wall and exchange resources by a different pathway and don't form a sheath around the root. So those are all details that you don't have to know to move forward. Again, it's not on the quiz, but just in case you're interested. So there is a high diversity of ectomycorrhizal fungi, over 5,000 species identified, and that's an old number, so it's probably much more than that now. So an estimated 50,000 species of these fungi globally. Individual hosts have hundreds of potential mutualists. So that means a single tree, a single stand can have tens to over 100 species. Typically, when you use the DNA methods, that's the sort of thing we find when we look at the root systems. And one tree can have more than 10 species on its root system. So you think about when you're looking at a tree, what you're actually looking at is a tree and its hidden mutualists that are below ground doing a lot of the work for that tree in symbiosis. And there's a lot of diversity. In addition to this, many thousands of species, there's a lot of functional diversity and anatomical diversity in these fungi. And you can see that in these root tips. You can see what we call exploration types of the fungi, which is just sort of one way to classify them as to how far out their hyphae go out into the soil. This one in the upper left here is called a contact type because it does not form very long hyphae. This one in the middle and the top is a short distance type. The one in the upper right is a medium distance type. It's a subclass fringing medium distance because it wraps around chunks of the soil and has hydrophobic mycelium. And then this one on the lower right is a long distance type. And this picture doesn't do it justice, but don't worry, I have some other pictures that'll show you what we mean by long distance and these relationships. And then this is on the lower left is a ascomycete. It's one of the most globally common mycorrhizas called Cenococcum that I put in. It's probably would be a medium distance type considered in this classification. But they also explore the soil in different ways, and they also all have many different physiological and biochemical systems for mining the soil for resources. And I'll touch on a little bit of that later in the end when we talk about nitrogen pollution. This is just showing those broad classes of contact, short distance, medium distance, smooth, other medium distance and long distance types. I'm not going to belabor that. But one way to be a long distance type is to have rhizomorphs, which are clusters of hyphae that are differentiated internally. And you can see it really well in this Boletus edulis here. You can see this is a hypha that does not have any septa in it, allows for rapid transport of water through the rhizomorph. So it allows the Boletus species to be very well adapted to drought stress and transport resources long distance through these networks. So here's just an example of a network from a rhizopogon, which is a bolete relative that forms truffle-like mushrooms. And you can see these long distance strands. These are the roots here, and you can see the long distance strands going out in the soil. And you saw it in the first picture as well. So they go out and they explore the soil. They're looking for resources. They're looking for other root tips, and they bring them back to the root in exchange with that plant. Versus these tips are colonized by different species, and you can see a much different morphology and anatomy of the mycorrhizas coming off of them. In fact, they're visible to the eye because they're so fine. So one of the questions that I thought would be a fun one to ask in this group, and we have something that'll sort of illustrate why that's happening. So why do mycorrhizal fungi mostly fruit later in the summer and fall on Monhegan? So if you remember, mycorrhizal fungi rely on their hosts for sugars, but they also live in an environment where temperature and moisture could be limiting. So we have a facility in Michigan where I live up here on the Keweenaw Peninsula right by Lake Superior called the Rhizotron. And these have windows looking out in the soil, and we use those windows to track what happens on the other side at biweekly intervals through the summer. We also have some time-lapse cameras here, and I'll show you some pictures from these time-lapse cameras that take pictures every half hour as well. But first off, just to see what is it that might be controlling the growth of fungi over one season. So just what you're going to see it here at the very beginning is it's starting in March, and we're under the snowpack here because our snow stays until April or May here. And so the soil is near freezing, and you see tiny little changes in the growth, very small growth of this mycelial fan here. This is a fungal hyphae. Each one of these squares is about a centimeter square. And the fungi are growing out. Now they're starting to grow a little faster. We're getting into probably early May, late April, early May, starting to grow fast, but then something happens. You'll notice it'll start slowing down. It doesn't accelerate even though the soil is warming up. And you see some growth even you get gaps in the growth. And we see very slow growth for several weeks, for maybe almost 6 weeks to a couple of months. Slow growth, and then you're going to notice it's going to start accelerating again here. This is getting into mid-July, and then they're getting into early August. And you can see the growth is just shooting out really rapidly. And so what we did is while this same thing is happening, we're measuring a few things. We're measuring the soil temperature, the soil moisture, and we're also measuring the phenology of the plants. So what plants are doing at the same time. And what we see is the growth. We can see that we can measure the growth rate, and we can see it's growing very slowly, then it accelerates, then it slows down again in this period here. We have some big gaps, and then it takes off again. And if we relate that before I'll show you another time lapse that shows something about phenology. Phenology is the timing of growth of plants or any organism, and we can see this is multiple years of growth of pine seedlings, and you can see it's under the snow now. I don't know I hope it's coming on your screens the same way. Now it's coming up, and you can see the new growth coming out. See that new green growth? That's all the carbohydrates of the above ground part of the plant are going into that new green growth. And so all the new fixed carbon is being shunted there. And it's not until that, and then you're going to see it again. Here's the new growth happening. So there's a period of the year when new growth of leaves and wood is happening above ground when there's not a lot of resources to be sent below ground. So when we partition the relationship of temperature to growth, we see that temperature predicts growth of these fungi really well. They grow really increase in growth as it gets warmer, as you might expect for a lot of organisms. It's hard to grow when it's really cold. Physiology slows down. They grow, and you can predict that relationship really tightly with these blue dots and this blue line. But then when the leaves are expanding, we see that relationship falls apart, and it becomes much flatter and much noisier. And that's because, at least our interpretation of that is, the sugars are just not available for the fungus to grow. So the above ground parts of the plant are competing with the fungus for sugars. And so the fungus slows down its growth greatly. It can still grow a little, but not nearly as much as when the carbohydrates are freely available. And so that, to us, is the context for why ectomycorrhizal mushrooms fruit later in the summer and early fall, is that they depend on the host for sugars. They fruit when temperature and moisture permit, so warmer is better, but also you also need for it to be there to be enough sugar being sent to them through the roots, so that late July, August, and September, for example, on Monhegan, is when you start to really see the mushrooms taking off. You'll see much fewer mushrooms in early July and in June on the island. Not none, but fewer. And these are just a few examples of some of the fungi that fruit prolifically in August on the island, if you're lucky. So here's another little mystery that sort of gives us a window into some of the complexities of what happens with mycorrhizal fungi and their partners. So most plants are photosynthetic, as we were just talking about, and they fix carbon from the atmosphere. They take CO2 out of the atmosphere and make sugar, and they share that sugar with other organisms. In this case, the mycorrhizal fungi. However, the ghost plants, the monotropas, so this is, in this case, the bottom one is called the ghost pipe, or the ghost plant, and the top one is called the pine sap. It's got a couple other names. They're both monotropas. They live on Monhegan, and they have no chlorophyll. So but they can still grow. And so, the mystery is, how do they do it? Now, some plants will plug directly into the root systems of other species, but when you dig around and you dig up the roots of these, they're not connected to other species. So people started wondering what the other mechanism would be. How do they get their carbon? And so some people suspected that mycorrhizal fungi were involved. And so it doesn't entirely make sense, because why would they have mycorrhizal fungi? Because they don't have any sugar to share, but they do. And when you use the molecular methods to look at the root systems of these plants, you see their relatives that are photosynthetic are mycorrhizal with a diverse group of these same basidiomycetes and ascomycetes we talked about before, but that when you compare that with these are all different non-photosynthetic lineages and the same close relatives of these other species here. So the vacciniums are the photosynthetic, and the Gaultherias are all photosynthetic. But these guys are non-photosynthetic, and they include this Monotropa hypopodes, which is the pine sap, and the Monotropa uniflora, which is the ghost pipe. And what they found was, when you look at these root systems, that they're consistently associated with one subgroup of mycorrhizal fungi. In the case of the ghost pipe, it's the Russulaceae, and I'll show you pictures of both the Russulas and Lactarius that form those partners. And then in the monotropas, it's Tricholomas, which is another lineage of mycorrhizal fungi. So it's typical for species that are parasitic to specialize on a smaller group of organisms. So it's at least one sort of conceptualization of these organisms, that they're parasitizing the mycorrhizal fungi. There are other thoughts that they may provide a beneficial relationship by providing a overwintering site for the fungi, despite the fact that they don't themselves fix carbon. They may provide a reserve of carbohydrates in their roots that they've accumulated there, that they then allows the fungus to grow back out and colonize again. So in any case, what you see in the forest, and if you're walking around, if you look carefully around these Monotropa unifloras in the forest, you'll often see Russulas fruiting near them. And there are quite a few species of Russulas and Lactarius that can form relationships with them. just because there's a fruit body next to it doesn't mean that is forming a relationship, but it's at least a clue that it might be. And so if you conceptualize, here's some other russulas that could be forming relationships. These are just examples of russulas on the island. And here's a Lactarius, just one nice picture of Lactarius. And the reason they call it Lactarius is because of the latex that comes out of them when you cut them. This like a milky material. And they are close relatives of the russulas. They're in the same family. And you can tell they're russulas or Lactarius because when you break their stalk, it breaks like chalk. It's a very distinctive characteristic because it has rounded cells in the stalk. So basically what seems to be going on is that the Russulaceae form form a relationship with these roots. The fungus, the Monotropa convinces the Russulaceae to form a relationship with them by chemical signals. And then the plant transfers sugars to the mycorrhizal fungus, and that fungus then transports them to the plant. And some of that carbon, either directly from the tree or back from here, forms the mushrooms that the Russulaceae make. And for the Monotropa, it's similar, but in this case, it's tricholomas. And here's a picture of a tricholoma just for reference for you guys. And in this case, the same sort of things going on, in that there's a transfer between the two, and then the tricholoma gets some of the carbohydrate from this mix, and the Monotropa is very happy because it's gotten sugar from through the mycorrhizal fungus. So one of the reasons this is interesting is just because it's interesting, right? Wow, that's really cool, and that's amazing evolution of that. But it also is pointed to the possibility that other plants could participate in similar sorts of networks. When, for example, when a plant is shaded, it doesn't have a lot of carbohydrates. Does it then receive some benefit from the mycorrhizal networks that it's part of? You can see on the right here, for example, that these two seedlings are connected together, and that this seedling is plugging into this network here that was formed with carbohydrates from this plant. So this plant grew most of this network and now is getting colonized by the fungus. And so it's plugging into this whole network and has access to it. To be clear, just to make, there's not one big happy network all the way through the soil. There's many, many different species, all of which, as I say, have different exploration types, will transport different distances. So in order to have a network between plants, there has to be a direct connection of an individual fungus between those two plants. So there's a potential for a network if the two kinds of plants can share the same fungus. And many mycorrhizal fungi will cross between different plant species. So that allows for bridging between species, for canopy trees and understory plants. So there is a potential for connections there, and there has been demonstrated sharing of individuals. So people have found the same genetic individual on plants, just like we can see it's happening here. When you dig up roots below ground, you can't see that connection. You have to do it using genetic methods, but that people have proven that happens. So we know that at a minimum, there's a subsidy of the hyphal network that the trees can plug into from the canopy trees from above, right, from the bigger trees. And studies show transfer of labeled carbon between plants in lab and some field studies as well. And I'll show you a picture of how that works. The exact magnitude, how important it is globally, is still an active area of study. So this is an area that's got a lot of people looking at it. But basically, the way people try to figure this out is they label the trees with either two different kinds of carbon, one radioisotope 14C or one stable isotope 13C, and they look to see whether that carbon is being transferred preferentially in one direction or the other, depending upon the light condition or what species it is, or how connected the species are, or whether they're connected at all. So in that as a way you can help to demonstrate that or test whether or not that it's happening. And some people find that can be fairly powerful, especially if you have a shaded tree and one in the sun. But again, it depends upon the conditions, the experimental settings. And some of you might have been hearing also about plant-to-plant communication. And that's another hot area of research. It's not my research area, but I thought I'd at least touch on it for the benefit of the group here. the concept here is that signals can from plant stress can travel through the air, soil, or through mycorrhizal fungi, and those signals could then essentially be part of a plant-to-plant communication. We know it happens through the air, we know it happens through the soil, and there's been demonstration of it happening through mycorrhizal networks as well. So it's one of multiple paths of communication between plants that says, I'm being attacked, sends out a signal that's a stress signal that's that then other plants will receive, whether or not it's intended for that purpose. They then will then respond by becoming defended themselves. They'll ramp up their defenses. And so there's a number of people trying to look at all the potential interactions in this network, both above and below ground. So it's a very hot area of research. And then there's another area that people are looking at, which is the concept of of intelligence in these systems. So that's an area that I think is it gets into semantic arguments, but the question is the ideas of learning and intelligence. So what do you mean? How do you define learning? How do you define intelligence? It's not my area of research. I won't pretend to give you the exactly what's going on in that area, but I would say it's an area of both intense activity and fairly strong debate about what's happening there. But I think there's some really interesting, it's going to stimulate some really interesting research that's going to really, I think, inform us about a lot of the things we really fully don't understand about these systems. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the environmental stressors that are affecting these species and what that might do to some of the networks that you see below ground, and also to the mushrooms that we see above ground. So the northern US has been hit by a large wave of invasive soil organisms, including a lot of European invertebrates, including like these slugs and like these pill bugs. So when you see pill bugs or slugs on the island, they are European species. They're not native to the eastern US, and they like to eat mushrooms. There are a number of other species that like to eat mushrooms that they're introduced as well. And the question is, what happens to mushrooms when these species are around? And I've done some time-lapse work on the island, looking at what happens to the mushrooms when these invasive species are around. So I'm just going to be quiet for a minute and point out some creatures as they appear. Right now, this is an Amanita starting to grow up from below the ground. This is a time lapse. About every 15 minutes, take a picture. So this is the course of several days here for the whole study. And that's a slug. It's one of those European slugs coming. Didn't do too much damage there, but there'll be plenty more chance for it to get a meal. And the mushroom still hasn't opened up, and you can see some good bites. Those are camel crickets. Those other crickets on there that are on there. There's some beetles coming as well. And then there's now the slugs you can see are the major agents of damage. Before it's even released any spores, they've eaten about half of the cap. Now it's about to start releasing spores, and hopefully it has a few minutes to do that before it gets eaten. Now the spores are being released, and that's it. So it's a pretty rough life to be a mushroom on Monhegan with the food webs that are established here. Why so many of the pictures you'll see that I take have the mushrooms have bites out of them. So that was above ground. What about below ground? And I don't have any footage from below ground from Monhegan, but I do have some from our rhizotron, and there it's going to focus on earthworms especially, but you'll see other organisms there as well. So Monhegan earthworms are also introduced from Europe, and they have pretty big impacts. They're called ecosystem engineers, which are organisms that directly or indirectly modulate the availability of resources other than themselves to other species by causing physical state changes in biotic or abiotic materials. And in this case, what that means is they really change the soil. So they eliminate the organic horizons and they consume and move soil carbon. And you can just sort of see the dramatic changes from going from a soil that has a thick organic horizon to one that has none, and also physically disturbing the soil below ground. And so we'll see that in this next video. We'll see some ectomycorrhizal fungal mycelium growing here, and we'll see roots. These are roots growing. This is a time lapse in our rhizotron facility, again, the one I showed you earlier. And these are, the white is fungal mycelium growing, and you can see these little rhizomorphs growing as well. And we're seeing that growing across this over the course of several months. And then we're going to see, we have a little pause here through a couple of months in the winter. So this is the winter, and you can see millipedes and centipedes come down into the holes made by the earthworms and live there in the winter. And these are earthworms moving through under the ground, and other insects you can see moving around. And you'll watch what happens to these mycelial mats, for example, over here, as the fungi come through and they consume the soil and they turn it over. So you can imagine if this fungal network was intact, it's been broken right now. So that's going to affect how the fungal network works. So it makes things more complicated for the fungi. Luckily, they have pretty complex networks. They have many routes and connections. So even though it's being disturbed here, there may be another connection elsewhere that allows it to continue to function as a network. But it does alter things. And now you're seeing root tips growing. These are mycorrhizal root tips forming on these roots, and you'll see more of that happening. Those are the root tips forming in here. And then there are root feeding insects in here feeding on those roots. So anyway, that gives you a sense of the complexity of what goes on below ground and what a fungus has to deal with in that environment. So another challenge to mycorrhizal fungi is nitrogen pollution. And that's an area of work I've done quite a bit of. So even though I didn't do the research on Monhegan, I've been keeping an eye on the communities of Monhegan to understand how they're doing. And I'll give you some context for what's going on here. So the humans have more than doubled the cycling of nitrogen in the global environment by processes, by combustion, by creation of fertilizer, all of which, and by raising of livestock, and by growing of nitrogen fixing plants, all of which has led to a lot more nitrogen going in the air and raining back down on ecosystems. And that is great as a fertilizer at some levels, but if it can be too much material or in the wrong places, it can have damaging effects on biodiversity. And so in Europe, there was in the late 80s, late 1980s, and early 1990s, evidence that there was decline of mycorrhizal fungi at a mass scale across all of Europe. And it was the point of people wondering if there was another mass extinction going on. And so one of the ideas for what was going on, so it just shows the kinds of things that were happening. So this is people went out and collected mushrooms over time, and these are when they did forays and collected mushrooms. This is what happened to certain groups. The most diverse group of mycorrhizal fungi is the Cortinarius, and they were essentially declining and disappearing by the early 1980s. And other groups like the hydnoid fungi, and I'm emphasizing these two groups because I'm going to show you some pictures from Monhegan of these groups. We're very ultra sensitive. We know much less about this group, but we know a lot about this group in terms of what it does for a living. And so we wondered why these species were disappearing. It was critically important to understand the causes of this decline. And we did quite a bit of research over the next couple of decades, and we identified nitrogen pollution as the dominant cause of this decline. and the declining groups were thought to be involved in mining for nitrogen from organic matter in the soil using enzymes that break up the organic compounds and make it available for uptake of amino acids and inorganic nitrogen. And going back to the exploration types I was talking about, the medium distance fringe and these medium distance mat exploration types are the ones that were most affected. And it seems like these types are the types that do a lot of that mining. And so the good news is that nitrogen deposition has been declining because of changes in regulations over the years. And so from the peak in the 1980s and 90s, there's been a decline up into the present. And excuse me, if you look at the map of North America and where that nitrogen deposition was happening, a lot of it was happening in the sort of the Midwest to Mid-Atlantic region, going up into southern New England, and even I approximately put Monhegan as this purple star here. You can see there was very little of that pollution back in the pre-industrial or early industrial era, but that by the 90s and 2000s there was a very high level of this deposition. These red is high deposition levels. But the good news is that as of now, those levels of deposition are declining. So this is a really good news environmental story from the perspective of nitrogen pollution on forests and on lakes and places like that where they're having detrimental impacts. So what does that mean? How is the fungal diversity doing on Monhegan? So what is that diversity in general, and how are the nitrogen sensitive species doing on Monhegan? And in particular, I'm going to focus on two groups that we mentioned in that earlier figure, the Cortinarius and these hydnoid fungi in the Bankeraceae. So I'm just going to give you just an impressionistic view of last summer fruiting on Monhegan. If anyone was out on the island and took a walk, you would have been struck pretty much like impossible not to notice that there was the incredible diversity of fungi fruiting on Monhegan. And in my memory, it's the highest diversity of fruiting on the island. Of course, I didn't always come in August. I sometimes come in late July, sometimes in June. But last year was by far the highest diversity. And just to show you the kinds of mushrooms we were seeing on the island. I'm just going to give you three overview slides. They're mostly unique, different species. There's a few repeats here because I just basically grabbed and put a bunch of images that I took last summer into this document. But this represents about 100 different species of fungi fruiting. And that certainly wasn't an exhaustive survey. It was what I could find in my walks. And it just represents just a really spectacular array and a beautiful diversity of fungi. And you will notice many of those fungi, like this Russula here and this Trichiloma, having bites out of them by the feeding invertebrates. But in any case, we still have a lot of diversity fruiting here. And then if we go to the groups of sensitive fungi, what are we seeing? And the good news is I see a lot of Cortinarius fruiting on the island and a diversity of Cortinarius, different types of quartz. And Cortinarius is easy to recognize because they have a cortina. You can see the remnants of that. It's like a spider web structure that covers the gills when they're young, and then as it grows, that it expands out and they hang off the edge sometimes if they're really well developed. And they have rusty spores. So if you see rusty spores in this cortina, you know it's a Cortinarius. And I see quite a few of them. And we know numerous studies demonstrate that this genus is as really heavily involved in mining nitrogen bound in soil organic matter. And so they're most beneficial to their partners under low nitrogen availability when those organic forms, mining them is really beneficial. And so that's really interesting. But then going once beyond that was something that I had never seen on the island. And if anyone in the groups has noticed them before, I'd love to talk to you more about it. But the group of the Bankeresse is one of the groups that's in Europe has been put on the red list because they're so many of the species on that group are so sensitive to nitrogen pollution that they were basically disappeared from large areas. And I had never really seen them fruiting on the island. And this last summer, I just saw them everywhere and in huge numbers. And given their sensitivity to nitrogen pollution, I'm wondering if it's a release from the pressure of the modest levels of N deposition or nitrogen deposition that Monhegan's been having over the past decades. So to me, whether or not they have been here in the past decades, certainly the fact that they're here now is a really good news story for the diversity of fungi on the island, and indicates that that there's not a heavy amount of nitrogen pollution on the island. And just a clear, this red arrow shows a close-up of the mat of mycelium that was at the base of the stalk of this one here. This is it's sometimes called strawberries and cream, or it's also called, like, what is it, a bloody tooth or something? I can't remember. Someone else probably remembers fungus, because it has these reddish droplets that form on the fruit bodies. Anyway, but that also forms these mats below ground, but no one has really done much work on exactly what the mats of this species do. When they've studied other mats, they show that they just go into the soil and they just mine the resources out of a patch, just really basically just mine the nutrients out of the organic matter and share them with their partners. So they're very adapted to these low nutrient, high organic matter ecosystems. So that, to me, I thought it was nice to end on a good news story about the island and about the diversity of fungi there. I'm just going to go briefly over what we learned. Recap: mushrooms are fungal reproductive structures. You can pick them without killing the mushroom, without killing the fungus. It doesn't harm it. Mycorrhizal fungi form beneficial relationships with plants. They have to wait to fruit because their host, until their host plant sends them enough sugar late in the summer. Because occasionally you'll get a little more earlier, but that's when they fruit the most. The monotropas, these ghost plants, are an example of net carbon transfer between plants via mycorrhizal fungi that you can see in your own backyard. Invasive invertebrates disrupt mycorrhizal mushrooms and mycelial networks, and so they probably have a big impact on some species, the ones that are more tasty to those organisms. And Monhegan fungal communities appear to be very diverse, including species very sensitive to nitrogen pollution. And to me, this is a good news story that says there's the systems are healthy now, and it's possible that we're seeing a recovery from past inputs. And if anyone living inshore or on the island has other insights or about the trends they've been seeing with this group, I'd be really interested to hear from you all. That's what I've got. So happy to open it up to questions from the group.
Thank you, Eric, so much for introducing us to the world of miracles right beneath our feet as we explore the Monhegan wildlands. And I think that from your talk, our knowledge and our sense of appreciation for the endless wonder and beauty of the wildlands has been truly deepened by what you've taught us. So thank you. And now Nan Nelson will be leading a 15-minute question and answer period with Eric.
Thank you very much, Eric. That was totally fascinating. And actually, everything you spoke about is tied in very closely, I know, with a book that I've just been reading called Finding the Mother Tree. So if any of you are interested in exploring this whole idea of fungal networks in forests, I heartily recommend that book. Earlier in the conversation, actually, let me backtrack for a moment. I'm going to kick off the conversation with a question. I am going to ask that if you have some questions that you put them in the chat, and then as the questions come up, I will share them with Eric and give him an opportunity to respond. But to get us going, I do have a question in my mind as I was reflecting on everything that had been said. For those of you who were not here right smack at the beginning, we were talking about how people had lived in California, and it got me thinking about climate change and actually the impact of forest fires and significant forest fires. And Eric, I was just curious as to whether or not you have any information about how do these massive fires that are increasingly problematic impacting fungal networks on the forest floor. Are they protected, or are they also destroyed with these intense burns?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There's been a fair amount of really good research on this topic in the West by a couple of groups, including the group I was a postdoc in. So I did watch that work pretty carefully. And it turns out that assuming the fire is sort of a stand replacing fire that does an intense burn on the soil, there is still what's called a resistant propagule bank, which includes both spores and things called sclerotia, which are basically vegetative material that can survive in the mineral soil, that is waiting there to colonize roots, and in some cases dormant in the soil for decades. Much like if people know the story of the pin cherry, a fire cherry that can last as a seed for 100 years in the soil of New England, and a fire comes and they'll germinate. Some of these Swillus and Rhizopogon spores just are actually, they start out dormant. They don't actually colonize roots right away, and after they've been sitting in the soil for a while, then they start colonizing roots. So that's the good news. But it will definitely affect the networks because you're killing the trees, you're often burning the organic horizon where many of the fungi live. But the ones that live below that in the mineral soil will survive and will be there ready to colonize root systems. If you have intact trees that are patchy, those will also serve as sources of inoculum, of vegetative inoculum that can then sort of grow out into the burnt areas. But it would be very unusual to get rid of all the inoculum with a fire. You'd have to have incredibly hot conditions that burned really deep down into the soil. I'm sure that happens in patches, like under burn piles, but on a larger scale, it's unlikely.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Okay, so we have a question from Ellen here that says, I have heard that certain invasive plant species actually change the soil that affects other plants. Do these plants affect the fungal networks?
That's another good question. One of the areas that you may have heard about, this may be what you're referring to, Ellen, is garlic mustard. It's in a group of plants that are non-mycorrhizal. There aren't that many, but there are some, and they're invasive in the understory. And there is some evidence that they do disrupt ectomycorrhizal networks. It could be directly because they produce these compounds that interfere with the fungi. I think they are actually, because they're non-mycorrhizal, they are looking for an environment where they have fewer competitors, so they may actually be disruptive of that. And these sort of allelochemicals that can be disruptive to mycorrhizae. So it really depends on the species of invasive. There are some others that could benefit mycorrhizae. There are actually invasive plants that have traveled around the world with mycorrhizal fungi. So in the Paramos in Ecuador, pine plantations have Swillus mushrooms that grow with them, that produce really abundantly, and people harvest them as food. And in New Zealand, there are mycorrhizal fungi that have come in with introduced an invasive pine species, and so it's thought that that mutualism helps the pines to invade. There are other examples of invasive mycorrhizal fungi too. I know that wasn't the question, but that have established in certain areas and been toxic to people. Amanita phalloides is a great example that people don't recognize as a toxic plant, and they eat it and they die from eating it in certain areas of the world.
Okay, so our next question is, are there any fungal networks considered invasive to native species like many plants? I think you kind of touched on
I think maybe I just touched on that one.
it. Okay. Anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I guess you have to think carefully about what you mean by invasive. And so invasive implies a negative. And so if in some cases, a species is planted as a species that has a lot of benefits to society, but then can also then spread into natural communities. And so if those fungal networks are themselves favoring the invasive species, that's one thing. Or the other question is whether people are concerned with the mycorrhizae themselves. And there are a couple of papers sort of discussing this issue and this question because it's largely been ignored. People have spread mycorrhizal plants around the world, and whatever came with those root systems is what's been spreading with them. There are a few people who've looked at that. But I guess invasiveness is a value judgment. And so we have to decide, well, is it a net negative or a net positive or a neutral, or does it have negative and positive elements? Earthworms are another example of that. A lot of people love earthworms for fishing bait, for example, and they're great in your vegetable garden, but maybe not as good in forests. So they're invasive in one setting, but beneficial in another.
Great. Okay, from Carol and Glenn, are there parts of our Monhegan trails that you have found particularly fruitful to observe?
Ooh. Oh, yeah, wow. I like going out to the towards the Greenpoint area in there and along those trails. There's all kinds of interesting stuff along those trails. Sometimes it just depends. Sometimes one trail is really like if it's drier than the wet parts along like trail number 5 are really good. If it's a little bit wetter than some of the dry areas to take off. So it really depends a lot on what you're looking for, what you're not. I recommend just hiking all the trails as often as you can. I think the least productive are probably, so just to flip it, are probably like the meadow area, and in there are a fair number of invasive earthworms in the village area that I think probably suppress some mushrooms. You go down towards the far end, you get a lot less of that. I don't think they like the soils out there as much, or they haven't gotten there yet. Probably a combination of the two.
Okay, thank you. Should and can the invasive invertebrates be eliminated?
Should is again that's a value judgment that you could have a long debate about, right? It depends on if there's in some cases you're not going to convince people to get rid of probably night crawlers, right? Which are these invasive. They're called Canadian crawlers, but they're actually European crawlers. But you're not going to get rid of them. But so the should is like, well, that's we'd have to have a debate about that. There are a lot of negative impacts on the northern forest where I live of these invasive earthworms, for example. There are other invasive weevils they feed on root systems as immatures, and then they feed on leaves as mature. So they're also fairly negative. Can is a question about biocontrol, and there are cases where organisms can be treated. The only way you'd really deal with something like this when they're at a large scale would be if you introduce a biocontrol agent that is done right. There have been a lot of examples of biocontrol done wrong, where people have introduced something like on Monhegan, not to point any fingers, but there have been plenty of introductions of what was it, the guinea fowl to control ticks, right? Well, that didn't work. There's the great example of I believe it was a mongoose to control snakes on Hawaii and other parts of the world, but they just don't do that. They actually eat birds. So there is a whole science of biocontrol that involves being super careful in finding organisms that are specifically targeted to your target organism and then releasing those. So there are cluster flies, for example, that attack earthworms. It is possible that there are other parasitoids of the earthworms that could be released in North America that are present in their home range that are controlling them somewhat there, that could be released to control them if that was a goal. But that's not a that's a judgment to be made after some very careful consideration about the pros and cons of introducing a new species. Because the unintended consequence could be, well, there's a native earthworm that gets killed off. Do we care more about that native earthworm or the invasive one?
So our next question is, how do you feel about foraging mushrooms on Monhegan?
I feel I think it's a wonderful thing to do if it could be done in a way that is in alignment with the associates' values. So it's a decision for the associates about whether they think it's the right thing to do. Whether I think there's a very an attitude of not harvesting anything on the island in the wildlands, and so the question is is there a plus of having a relationship where you go out and actually spend the time looking for these things that makes people connected to nature? Just like when we go out fishing, we go out and collect and harvest the fish from the ocean around the island. Is that so it's just a question of being done in a responsible way, in a way that's in line with whatever regulations are around. So if the associates say it shouldn't be done, then it shouldn't be done. But if yeah, so
actually, Eric, I have a follow-up question to that. If there was foraging that was to happen in the wildlands, do the mushrooms quickly and easily regenerate, or yes?
Yes, yeah, it doesn't affect the mycelium underground at all.
Okay.
So what it'll only affect is people's ability to see that mushroom, that particular mushroom. And so there are parts of the world where people go overboard on mushroom harvesting. And in fact, in the Western US, it's a commercial harvesting. That shouldn't be happening on Monhegan, obviously, but the commercial harvesting creates conflicts among people who have their territories that they defend against each other, and they've shot at each other for stealing the mushrooms off their territory. So I mean, people can get very
Territorial.
Yeah, exactly. But that should not be the case on Monhegan, of course. And I think also the trick is to, if you did decide to do harvesting, is to recognize that you shouldn't take everything you see. That's another approach to this that you could consider.
Okay, so the last question we have at the moment is, do wild animals eat mushrooms? And if so, how do they know which are poisonous?
Well, if you consider a slug a wild animal, then you already know the answer, right? You're talking about mammals. Yeah, I mean, if anyone was ever walking in the forest of Monhegan when the deer were here, and if you watched the deer, I watched them eat mushrooms. How do they know? That's an excellent question. I don't have the answer to that, but I do know that deer, for example, had a much more complex digestive system than us. So they had like the essentially, the ability to detoxify a lot of things that we can't. So they can eat twigs from trees and actually get nutrients out of them and things like that. So I imagine some wild animals make mistakes sometimes and would be killed. That we know that happens with monarchs. Things that eat monarchs do occasionally get poisoned by them, right? So, and I'm sure that happens with mushrooms too, but I don't know that it's documented.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. Is there anyone else who would like to ask Eric a question? Oh, let's see. One more question just popped up. Are there certain natural environments, for example, certain plants or trees under which mushrooms grow, which would be an automatic signal that they would be toxic?
No. Well, I guess if they were growing in near Chernobyl, don't eat the mushrooms near Chernobyl. But that's a natural environment that's been altered by humans. So if you're an environment, because fungi will bioaccumulate toxins. There's after above ground testing, there was a concentration in like reindeer moss and in lichens of a lot of the radioisotopes and things like that. So you do have to be careful if there's those sorts of toxins in the environment. but certain plants or trees, no. I can't think of an example of that. It's possible that it exists. I guess I wouldn't try collecting them under poison ivy, because certainly you could get in trouble there, but not because of something in the mushroom itself.
Great. Well, thank you. That seems to be the end of the questions. Candace, I guess it's time to return to you. Thank you, Eric.
Yes, I'm just going to wrap this up with a couple of remarks. I wanted to ask everyone to join the network of donors that communicate with each other and supply nurturants to Monhegan Associates. Please join the community effort to keep the wildlands wild enough to support the magnificent universe of fungal networks to continue to exist. So please go to the MAI website and donate. And now I just want to thank Eric again, and I want to thank all of you for coming to the lecture tonight. We hope to see all of you next summer at the MAI Summer Lecture Series. Stay tuned and good night.
Thank you, Candace.
And I saw Lenora had a question. If she wants to stay on, I can try to answer it.
I want to say thank you to everyone. I'll be sending you a link to the recording of it in case you want to go back over some of Eric's slides.
Great.
So Lenora, I think your question got skipped. Let me just
Did I
see
miss
if I can read it again. Is there evidence that invasive invertebrates disrupt the mycelial network to the extent that it's affecting tree or other plant growth? That's a really good question. There are places where regeneration of certain plants seems to be affected by earthworms. So the best example I can think of is it's a goblin fern that is I believe fully non-mycorrhizal and lives in the forest floor in the organic horizon. And earthworms disrupt the mycorrhizal networks that probably depends upon. So that would be, the kinds of things where you need a specific network intact could be most likely to have the biggest impact. There are other people who have looked at the disruption of mycorrhizal networks by invasive earthworms and it seems quite possible that certain tree species seedlings do not do as well under those conditions of the disruption of the networks. So we do see changes in regeneration in the forest floor and under earthworms in our region, separating out exactly the causal mechanisms, whether it's the loss of the organic horizon or the physical disruption of the networks is hard to do. But there is evidence that there is some impact on them of the invasive invertebrates that's cumulative of all the different changes in the system.
Okay, so are all the questions answered, addressed? Looks like it. Okay, so good night, everybody. Hope to see you next summer on the MAI Summer Lecture Series.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for the invitation. It was really fun.
Thank you, Eric.
Yep, bye all.